Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the World Affairs Council Upstate for this America and the World Conversations event. Losing the rainforest, do Brazil's policies threaten our future? The Amazon plays a critical role in the Earth's climate system as an important ecosystem. All across the news yesterday, I saw a wide array of publications talking about this issue. For years, Brazil was a global leader in climate change. But in 2020, deforestation surged to a 12-year high. Brazil is heading towards missing its own target for reducing annual deforestation. How should Brazil protect this ecosystem for everyone, especially their own people, while also taking care of their citizens and their economic development? That's some of the questions our speakers will try to handle today. This World Affairs Council Upstate is a part of a nationwide system of organizations who have really dedicated themselves to engaging their communities in foreign policy, global impact issues, and in international business. We're non-political, non-partisan, and we strive to bring you these topics in the most academic and realistic way we can. We're unbiased and non-political, so please, we ask that you keep your questions in that spirit. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we depend on your support to make all of these events possible. If you're not a member, please consider joining today. Your membership brings global engagement home to the Upstate in many, many ways. If you have questions during this presentation, just type them into the chat. They'll be given to the speakers by our moderator. Our speaker events are also being recorded, so if you've missed any, check us out on the Upstate International YouTube channel. So I'd like to hand this off now to Rob Rowan. Rob is the chair of the World Affairs Council Upstate, and he'll introduce our speakers.
Thank you again for attending, which is our last program of this series. In September, we start up live, and we hope to see you at the Kroc Center. So excited about doing something face-to-face. We'll have some really good lunches there and some great speakers. Let me first start with, and I want to thank all these people participating, but Dr. Karen Allen, whose training is in cultural anthropology with an interactive training across disciplines relevant to conservation and sustainability science, in particular ecological, economics, and landscape ecology. She focuses her research on the sustainability of social ecological systems with a particular emphasis on Latin America. And in her teaching and mentoring, she seeks to provide experiences for students to critically analyze the feasibility of environmental policy within the complexity of human-environment interactions. So that's a mouthful, but it's really important these days for what she's doing. Her publications focus on landscape-level impacts of land use decisions and the complex value systems that inform and shape human behavior. She is an assistant professor of sustainability science and anthropology at Furman University. Thank you, Karen, for being part of it. Our next expert in the field is Bob Inglis, who you might remember was a congressman in our area. He is the executive director of Republic N organization. In 1992, he was elected to Congress, and he represented Greenville-Spartanburg in Congress. He was served there, and in 2004, he was re-elected again and served until 2010. In 2011, I think motivated by what he was seeing happening, he went in full-time promoting free enterprise action on climate change and launched the Energy and Enterprise Initiative at George Mason University, which is rebranded into becoming republicn.org, which is a grassroots community of over 10,000 Americans educating the country about free enterprise solutions to climate change. It's hosted by George Mason University. It recruits and organizes conservative voices for action on this issue. For his work on climate change, he was given the 2015 John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award. He appeared in the film Merchants of Doubt and in the Showtime series Years of Living Dangerously. Bob, I'm glad that you could be part of this. Thank you. And our moderator is someone who is not new to working with us, and I'm really excited to have him back. Dr. Wester Drips has been extremely passionate about studying Earth systems. He grew up in suburban Philadelphia and went on to study geosciences at Amherst College, Dartmouth College, and the University of Wisconsin, where he got his PhD. In between degrees, he worked as an exploration geologist in the oil, gas, and water sector, an environmental consultant, a hydrologist, a high school teacher, an outdoor educator in the Swiss Alps, and a nightclub disc jockey, which I think really helps in this. But he's a man for all seasons. At Furman, he's known as an engaging teacher and an active researcher and an environmental activist, and has been involved with the university's sustainability efforts and sustainability student living communities. He's the executive director of the Shai Institute for Sustainable Communities and a professor of Earth, Environmental, and Sustainability Sciences at Furman University. His talk about climate change a couple of years ago, which is one we had, was a big hit. I still use things that I learned from him in my discussions when we talk about the importance of climate change. Thank you, Wes, for coming again, and I have it. And then at this point, I welcome you all to enjoy hearing from Dr. Karen Allen. Karen, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all so much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen. It's always a challenge, right? If you don't see a PowerPoint slide that says deforestation in Latin America, then please interrupt me and let me know. Otherwise, I'll just start talking. Wonderful. What the slide that I have here, I just want to, is a kind of a classic, what they call the fishbone deforestation. And this is a classic, so I substituted the typical Furman background for this fishbone pattern of deforestation, that's satellite imagery from the Amazon, as a little bit of context. So to begin with, I'm going to offer some context on what's currently occurring in Brazil. And there's been a lot of news coverage since the rise of President Bolsonaro, who was elected in 2018, and the subsequent deregulation of the state that has ensued. And one take-home point that I would like to make about this is that the conversations are fairly, these kinds of conversations, while Bolsonaro is extremely important figure and at causing some major changes that we're going to talk about and address, it's sort of representative of some constant conversations that we see about deforestation in Latin America. And these conversations are not so foreign to the US context, right? So these ideas of what is the role of the state, should we place restriction on the market, should we be developing our natural resources? We see these on a global stage. And so the difference may be being here that Latin America has a strong history of state presence. And as mentioned, Brazil has sort of, I would say, maybe a vacillating history in terms of how intensive they are in protecting the Amazon, but certainly prior to Bolsonaro had a more perhaps hearty effort to protect the Amazon. But also that Latin America has a strong history of regional movements, such as the fairly recent but now defunct pink tide of socialism in Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia, that do shape some of the cultural polarization on this issue and some of the rhetoric that you might hear coming out of Bolsonaro. So for context, for those not familiar, and I'm hoping you can see my little cursor here, that this is where the Amazon rainforest, so here's our country of Brazil, right? And this is within South America. And just, I want to point out right now that I have a bunch of slides that are taken from publications, and I'm happy to make these slides available if there's a forum for that. And there are ways to kind of look further into the articles and the information where all this came from. Every slide should have that. So here's our map of Brazil, and the Amazon rainforest is in this section right here. And what you're seeing is the difference of light green is where some of that biome has been removed, as opposed to the green where it's still more intact. And this is a paper from 2019, so fairly recent analysis that we're seeing here. And then this paper and also a lot of the articles talk a bit about deforestation that's happening in the Amazon savanna as well, which is in this region. But of course, we're going to focus on the Amazon rainforest today. Sorry, the Brazilian savanna. And so one take-home point from this map is that though the Amazon does stretch into neighboring countries, Brazil, the vast majority of it is in Brazil, and that charges Brazil with the pressure to protect this rainforest. and the potential conflicts that they see ensuing from there. This is an article that was part of the slew of articles that we may have seen about, well, this is from 2019, of those Amazon forest fires that were really burning out of control. And there was a lot of finger pointing amongst environmentalists and the government about who's to blame for these forest fires. Scholars, however, seem fairly unanimous in asserting that the deregulation of the Amazon, including defunding environmental agencies and a fairly aggressive rhetoric from Bolsonaro and his staff, disregarding the importance of Amazon protections, carries much of the blame. And that rhetoric is going to come back because that does pay, it has severe consequences for individual actions that are happening in these not tightly regulated areas. So this is a picture of a forest fire, again, in Brazil. And Bolsonaro has essentially put himself at odds with other nations over the protection of these forests, characterizing himself in a little bit of a kind of bullying rhetoric that has real consequences for the forest in terms of people encroaching into these areas and disregarding any regulations that may still be existing. And as well as, I think it's really important to point out the indigenous people and the consequences. And my next slide is going to talk about that a little bit. It's also important to point out that sometimes Bolsonaro will talk about kind of these, you know, these rural people, small holders that are active in this deforestation, when in fact most evidence points to it being these agribusiness that has the large sort of machinery to be able to take down this rainforest, right? And so there's a bit of hand waving, but there's also evidence that we can monitor this from satellite imagery. It's detectable. And if the government had some willingness, there would be definite measures of increasing the effectiveness of forest protection. A quote that I found pretty powerful in all of this was Bolsonaro. This was in the New York Times. Germany, there's a conflict between Germany removing funding for some conservation because of the policies of Bolsonaro. And he said, take that money and use it to reforest Germany, okay? You need it way more than we do here. And in that statement, I feel like he really illustrates an issue that goes beyond Brazil, that we see in many developing countries, which is this continual tension between global north and global south, about who should determine the fate of the remaining world's forests, many of which of these are in developing nations. And as a final point for context, as I mentioned before with indigenous people of Brazil, they are some of the most critical stewards of the forest to this day. This picture shows the impacts of gold mining in Yanomami lands, one of the many indigenous groups that inhabits the Amazon rainforest. And what we're seeing is encroachment upon their lands, and in part because of this environmental deregulation that he has been promoting since his candidacy. And this is the same history that we've seen kind of across the world, which in terms of removing lands from indigenous people in favor of development. And so again, here we've seen similar patterns in the United States, most recently witnessed with the Dakota Access Pipeline. Quite tragically, and I think it's important to mention this, the Yanomami people have been exposed quite a bit to COVID through this process, and there have been alarming rates of disease amongst the population. So moving forward, while I certainly feel that the current situation in Brazil is both alarming and tragic, my goal here today is to help you all see this as part of a larger trend that has been occurring for a very long time. While I will suggest steps we can take with Brazil right now, this issue is really a marathon, and we're running out of time from my perspective. We all should be concerned about the loss of these last critical forested areas, and combating deforestation will take a huge global effort that I believe the US could take a critical role in, despite the fact that we have not tended to historically. Okay, so deforestation, why is it happening? Forgive the clip art image of sorts there, but the simple answer is money. We live in a global system of resource exchange where really regardless of internal politics, and I know that's a hard thing to kind of think about, but nations and actors within nations need to make money to compete in our global capitalist system and generate wealth for their citizens. And this means that internally there's kind of a pressure on all nations to capitalize on resources that they have. Brazil has been sitting on some of the largest deposits of natural resources left on the planet for a very long time, which is one of the reasons why they're continually on the emerging markets list, if you will. And so there's a long history of this idea of whether or not to develop the Amazon that dates from far before I became a scholar of Latin America and certainly before Bolsonaro's presidency. Very, very short history of some of these trends. Perhaps you're all familiar with rubber plantations of the colonial era in the Amazon rainforest. We can see similar, and these cash crops really we see throughout the Americas, right? So this desire to capitalize of agribusiness, generate wealth through the selling of these crops on international markets. Again, for context here in the United States, we can think of tobacco and cotton. In Central America, we have indigo plantations at this time period, right? And so these are the equivalent of kind of gold mining of trying to get some sort of revenue out of these lands, right? And so moving forward to much more recent times, there's this idea of the hamburger hypothesis that many might remember from the 80s and 90s. There was a lot of kind of public discourse about this. Which is when the rise in change in diets to a more meat-based diet and the rise in populations happening in the latter half of the 20th century saw this huge demand for beef across the Americas and really was considered the culprit of much deforestation happening in tropical areas at the time, Brazil also being a part of this. And so the idea being that beef was driving tropical deforestation. But of course, when we try to regulate beef, we end up with another cash crop. So more recently, soy. Many of you may have heard of soy being a problem in the Amazon as a driver of deforestation as well. So I want to just get back to this take-home point that in a way, it's this pressure that we've created, but we all experience on this global scale to convert natural resources to financial capital. And the forest typically, and this is kind of at the heart of a lot of the stuff I look at, ends up being the least competitive land use. And so we place regulations, and I'm going to talk about the policy hopefulness of these. But when Bolsonaro talks about a capitalist solution, which is a common term he's using, to the Amazon, what he means is we need to get it to fund itself and have it be the most competitive land use, and a tropical forest typically will lose out in that. But this is not something, again, I mean, it's not entirely unique to the Amazon in the sense that in Costa Rica, where I do a lot of my work, we see this with pineapple. Indonesia with critical habitats, we see this with African palm oil, which is in every product. And so this is a problem on a global scale. So why should we care about deforestation? Okay, so my next point is why we should care about deforestation. And I don't have time to go into the dynamics of climate change, although it sounds like Dr. Drip has done a wonderful talk in the past that people could tune into. But in short, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a major driver of climate change, and trees suck in carbon dioxide. So they are what we call carbon sinks. And it is one of the reasons why forests are so important, because they have the potential to draw carbon dioxide in the atmosphere while we're pouring large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through our burning of fossil fuels. I'm going to pull up here an article, and hopefully it'll work smoothly. Y'all see a picture of a guy climbing a tree here? Thumbs up. I don't see anybody, but hopefully, hopefully someone will interrupt me if you don't see a picture of a guy climbing a tree here. So this is an article that came out in Vox that I really just am gonna borrow it for some of these visuals that I thought were really beautiful and powerful and better than things I can generate, as art is not my forte. And this is showing us, they're really focused on these kind of super species and the ways they regulate climate. And they're showing us a Brazil nut tree in the Amazon and how tall they are. And their take-home point is that they have huge roles in Amazon in regulating the climate within the Amazon. And we know that on a global scale, the Amazon is a major driving factor of climates across the globe, which is almost sort of harrowing to think about the role of this one very large ecosystem. So these trees can actually, they pull up water. So as many trees are important in climate regulation. So they pull up water and they actually help the Amazon produce about 50% of its own rainfall. And the reason I bring this up is because it's important to think about ecosystem collapse. If we get to a certain point of Amazon deforestation, we may not actually generate enough water within the Amazon for it to can produce its own rainfall. And so that what we'll start to see is a drier Amazon. And despite our best efforts, it may begin to suffer a runaway collapse that we can't come back from. And so that's part of this urgency issue in terms of halting deforestation now. And then this last image here I just found really beautiful of showing how, and this is in some Netflix series sometimes cover this as well, how the amount of moisture generated in the Amazon is quite critical to shaping. So beyond the carbon sink factor that I mentioned, it's quite critical to shaping climate across the globe because this moisture travels then across the globe and influences climate in other places. So really important there. And to get back to my slides, again, hopefully we're back on my slides now. Beyond climate, there's other reasons I think we should care about deforestation. Forests in general house biodiversity. And this is from the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They put out a report about a year ago showing a rather fast cases of species loss that we're having on the planet. And a big driver of this is both climate change and loss of habitat. And these species do important things for us. One of which, probably one of the best known, is our pollinators, right? So keeping species alive, we need them to pollinate fruits and vegetables that we eat. They also are important in water quality regulation, soil restoration. So we talk about these as ecosystem services or benefits we get from the ecosystem that we kind of silently depend on without often knowing. And if we lose these, we're going to start to see some pretty big impacts. To draw on a very recent example, some of these storms that we're seeing now with our intensified hurricane season, which is a direct, is one of the predictions of climate change, is impacting Central America so severely that we're seeing new waves of immigration in the United States because people are losing their homes in Central America. So these things have impacts for things like immigration policy that we might not necessarily make those connections. And I couldn't help myself because of my field that I also think we should care for intrinsic reasons. This is my own picture of a super cool caterpillar in Costa Rica. And the idea of losing diversity of species on the planet. I think we share a planet and I think we should care about them. But I recognize that that's an opinion. But I'm happy to share that opinion. Okay, so final points here. What can we do about it? And this is, I believe, where the rest of our conversation is going. I was charged primarily with giving a little bit of background and context. So I have some suggestions. I'm going to borrow from a scholar, John Foley, who is a well-known scholar in the field of kind of agroscience. And he gives a TED talk that I actually use in one of my classes where he talks about this idea of silver buckshot as opposed to a silver bullet. And I think that's a great way of thinking. It's how I think about these problems, which is there's probably not one solution. There's probably not one policy that's going to fix it all. But rather we need to try multiple things to to make the changes that are needed in order to preserve these habitats. So in terms of the rainforest, there are certified products that can help in terms of being able to continue with agriculture, but do so in a less damaging way. And the Rainforest Alliance has their own certification, so I thought of that one. I know they've done a lot with rainforest certified coffee, for example, because coffee can be grown in a way that's quite, it can be grown in a way that's quite compatible with the environment, but it can also be grown in very damaging ways. So to have a rainforest certification gives a price premium on that coffee. We pay more for it, but we have an organization out there making sure that it's potentially less damaging to the environment. Eating lower on the food chain. One of the things I talk about with my students is I'm not telling everyone to be a vegetarian. I'm actually not a vegetarian. But if we just make an effort to eat more plants, it actually has a huge impact because we need to use more land and more resources to grow a cow than to grow the equivalent calories in a plant. And so thinking about your diet, I guess would be my take-home point. Thinking about your diet and the ways you're consuming things and how those are impacting across the chain. Oh, and there's my little picture. Supporting local business is an interesting concept. I don't think, again, this idea of silver buckshot, one of the things that happens, I think, sometimes is in our global chain is we're unaware of the consequences of things that we buy and the things that we do. And so by supporting local, you can, not always, but you can have a more direct tie to the ways in which these things are impacting both social structures and the environment. And you can keep a little bit more money close to home, which tends to be good for an economy. And finally, which is where we're going, is this idea of policy. And so many of you have probably heard of the Paris Agreement. It's been a hot topic over the last 10 years. Prior to that, there was the Kyoto Protocol. And these are international efforts. They are not imperfect. There are problems with them. However, they're international efforts of getting these large superpowers on board and all nations to think about how what's happening within a country, how a country is developing, and how a country is using the natural resources are now starting to impact us on a global scale so that we have to worry about what happens in Brazil. And as long as that's the case, then we're going to have to participate in these international agreements if we want to be able to do anything about it. And the US as a superpower, I believe really needs to show some leadership in these issues. And there's a lot of, and from here, we're gonna sort of move on to the policy sector and our policy expert. But there are a lot of ways in which the US can show leadership, and we can try to move these sorts of agreements forward. So questions for the chat box as I understand it. And from here, we are going to move to the next person.
And I suppose that's for me to pick up with. Bob Inglis here, as you see there at republican.org, we're conservatives reaching conservatives on climate change, as you heard from Rob. And it's a great setup that that Dr. Allen has just given me to launch into this policy discussion. The thing that's interesting about climate change, or not interesting, that's a terrible word that hides all the pain in it, isn't it? The devilish thing about climate change is it's the opposite of the mantra that we've come to know. We've come to know the mantra that we need to think globally and act locally. There's some truth to that in the case of climate change, but mostly climate change turns that on its head. We've got to act globally and think locally when it comes to climate. And that's why it is so devilish. You got to figure out some way to get those Brazilians to do the right thing with their rainforest. Well, that's pretty tough to do because it's their rainforest. And they elect a government that, in my opinion, is nuts, but they did it. And so there are people like that I know, some very charitably minded people who bought up a great deal of land in the Amazon with the intent of preserving it and had every good intention. And then a government comes to power. And the problem with that approach is, gee, if that government won't enforce your property rights or respect those rights, then wow, you just spent an awful lot of American dollars on land that you really can't control. Wow, that's a problem, isn't it? So here's the thing. How do you get the world in on this? And this is all very topical right now. You know, this is where we are in the American discussion. And of course, some would say, well, Inglis, how's that working out for you so far? Get those conservatives in on climate action. Well, it's a building year, coach. That's what you say when you're not winning yet, right? But we're building, we're getting there. More and more conservatives are coming around, particularly young conservatives are coming around to the reality of climate change. But here's where I think we've got to think about how to act globally and think locally. Because Dr. Allen just pointed out that, you know, with the Paris Accord, we had the establishment of a will, not a way, but a will. And that's a good thing. You know, anytime you're going to try to solve a problem, you need to start with the will. And then you got to find a strategy, a series of ways to get there. So we're obviously Republican and conservative based on the name of that organization right there. So we think it's a bad idea to withdraw from Paris. Strange place for my country to be, sniveling on the sidelines, saying it's not fair to us when the rest of the world was already in on it. That's a strange place for us to be. Seems to me that we should be sitting at that table, helping to lead the world to solutions on climate change. So yes, good to return to the Paris Accord. That's in process right now. That's a good thing. But then how do you get this policy, this worldwide policy in place? That's pretty tough, you know, not just America, but worldwide. And so what we are fond of saying to fellow conservatives is there are three ways to fix climate change. One is you can regulate it. That's the answer that people who believe in government regulation come up with quickly. It's a respectable position. It's just not our position. But basically, it's people who say, listen, we need to regulate down to 350 parts per million, and let's have the government step in and do that. Even if we weren't conservatives who sort of break out in hives when you mention those regulations, we'd still recognize the weakness of this approach, which is you can't regulate China. And so you can regulate here, and if you do, the regulated might pick up and move there. Well, once they get there, they'll emit more than they're emitting here because we're more energy efficient than they are in China. And so you may actually go downhill in solving climate change, but you will achieve local cleanup of air, and that's a good thing. We'll clean up the local air, but we won't be solving for climate change through that regulatory approach. Now, of course, in fairness to people who would advocate that approach, if China follows our moral example, maybe that'd be fine, but how's that working out for us on human rights, for example? So why would it work on climate change? I don't know. Second way to approach climate change is to incentivize it, incentivize technology. And this is a place where a lot of fellow Republicans will locate for a while, we think. They'll join many Democrats in saying, listen, let's incentivize technologies. Let's do extended solar credits, wind credits. These are all tax expenditures where you manipulate credits, exemptions, and deductions in the tax code. Has the same effect as direct appropriations from the federal government in terms of the budget deficit. But they're sort of seen as easier to do because after all, you're just giving tax incentives. And so if I were still in Congress, I'd be voting for some of these things because they would help in terms of getting early adoption of technology in America. And if there's a mass market, you can expect that early adoption to bring down the price of the widgets dramatically. So for example, in cell phones, there's 7 billion people around the world that would like to have a cell phone. And so if you've got that kind of mass market, the price of the individual unit comes down dramatically as entrepreneurs seek to attract customers. But in the case of, for example, the power industry, there are what, maybe 10, 20,000 firms in the whole world that are in the business of making electricity. And so it's a relatively small market. So while we can incentivize American technology through the American tax code and adoption here, those incentives don't apply elsewhere. You could argue, yes, but the early adoption here will cause the price to come down and be affordable in the rest of the world. True, but in that limited market, will it come down enough to make it affordable? And if it doesn't, then just like in the regulatory approach, you cleaned up local air, but you haven't solved for climate change yet. So then that leads you to the third approach, which you can tell is the one I favor because it's the one I'm keeping for last, is simply pricing it. Just price in the negative externality, internalize the negative externality associated with the burning of fossil fuels through the upstream application of a carbon tax. Oh, just said the word tax. Oh, golly. At the mine, at the pipeline. But then pair that tax with a dollar for dollar reduction in other taxes. If you're a conservative like me who cares about regressivity, or a progressive who naturally cares about regressivity, and you understand that a carbon tax by itself, a naked carbon tax, hurts poor people, it is regressive, then you might want to pair that carbon tax with a reduction in payroll taxes, the FICA tax, that it's a 6.2% employee, 6.2% employer tax on the first dollar of income. It's a whoppingly regressive tax. If you reduce that tax and put on a carbon tax, the Congressional Budget Office says the bottom 70% of Americans do better under that new system of carbon taxation rather than payroll taxation. Or you can dividend the money from the carbon tax back to the citizenry, and that also addresses regressivity. So as you can tell, we're conservatives who don't want to grow the government in solving climate change, so we naturally want the tax to be revenue neutral. But we join every progressive who's ever talked about a carbon tax in asking for a second distinctive feature of the carbon tax, and that is that it be border adjustable, applied to imports at our borders if the goods are coming from a country that doesn't have the same price on carbon dioxide. And if you follow that, what you see is it makes it in the interest of our trading partners to follow our lead. Because it's like this, we put the tax on. There's a sheet of flat steel coming through the port of Charleston right now, let's say from China. We apply our carbon tax. China objects in the World Trade Organization. They say that's an impermissible tariff. You can't do that, they say. We defend based on precedents in the chemical industry that say you can have a content tax. And this would be a content tax. If we're right and we win that case, China within 24 hours, because they do have an amazing way of reaching consensus, as you know, in China, would impose the same price internal to China. Why? Well, they just paid in Charleston a carbon tax that got remitted to Washington. If they'd collected that tax in China, the tax money would have ended up in Beijing, and the sheet of flat steel would have come through Charleston with no adjustment. So 24 hours later, they got the same price on carbon dioxide. And then the whole world's following. Because if you're doing business anywhere in the world, you're doing business with America and China. And so, and by the way, if you're a progressive and you think, gee, what Inglis is talking about, he's given all this high octane conservative language, sounds familiar. Well, it might be because it's exactly the same thing that Al Gore has been advocating for about 30 years. So we happen to believe we can bring America together and lead the world to solutions. But I should also add, though, that as Dr. Allen just said, there's no real silver bullet here. There are silver buckshots. And this carbon tax, while most economists would tell you, and I know in this age of overstatement, that sounds like an overstatement, but actually it's not. Most economists would tell you that that carbon tax I just described is the first most obvious thing to do about climate change. And it is a big bullet that has a very large impact on emissions. But it won't solve the enormous challenge that Dr. Allen was just talking about with preserving the Amazon and the species there. Those things will require all those steps that she was talking about certified products and thinking about how we eat. All these things will definitely have to be there as well. So it's not like this one thing that I'm talking about would fix all the Amazon problems, but it would begin the process of getting the whole world in on this thing. And it would take us beyond moral signaling here in America to actually lead the world to solutions. So great to be with you and look forward to your questions.
Excellent, Bob. Thank you to you and Karen for, I think, really setting the stage for a great conversation we'll have now. And I'll remind folks that they have questions to go ahead and put anything in the chat. I know there are a few that are in there that we'll get to in a second, but I wanted to follow on a couple things. I'll start with you, Bob, in terms of, I love the idea in terms of, I think you've laid out a really nice case in terms of maybe 3 different approaches. Where do you feel, knowing that you're interested in this pricing of carbon, where realistically do you think we are in that discussion here in the US? I mean, how realistic is that option? I realize that, governmentally with elections happening every 4 years, there's this turnover all the time, and so it can be favorable and not favorable. But I mean, are you really optimistic that that is something that we could see sometime in the near future?
Well, having lived through the financial crisis, I remember a guy saying back then, it's amazing how the impossible went to the inevitable without ever passing through the probable. The President Bush's rescue of the banks is what he was talking about. It was impossible. Are you kidding me? You can get a bunch of Republicans to vote for that? It happened. The impossible went to the inevitable without ever passing through the probable. I think that's what's going to happen on the carbon tax. But I do think you're onto something, Wes. Right now, it looks pretty near impossible, right? I mean, it's like even yesterday, another bad news story in the Washington Examiner about Republicans putting on a competing conference next week in Washington. It's basically going to be some presentations from them. And the leadership aide wanted to make it clear that, make no mistake about it, we're not for a carbon tax. And so even yesterday was that disappointment. So we face that all the time at republican.org, but we persevere and hope because we just happen to believe that eventually conservatives will remember that Milton Friedman had a solution to this, and actual conservatives know to sort of bow at the mention of his name, the father of modern conservatism. By the way, if you're a populist nationalist, they don't either know or care who Dr. Friedman was. But if you're an actual conservative, to really pay attention to him. On the Phil Donahue show one time, Phil Donahue says, what do you do about pollution then, Dr. Friedman, if you don't want to regulate it? Friedman says, you tax it. You tax pollution. That's the conservative answer. And the exciting thing is, it's also Al Gore's answer.
Yeah, and I love the idea, again, I think you've really thought it through, the idea of the trade-off kind of in it. So it's not just an added tax. I think I love the fact that you've really thought through that idea of kind of like, how do we benefit the greater good in this by not necessarily elevating taxes across the board? Karen,
Yeah,
I
'cause
want
you got to make sure that you don't hurt poor people in this.
right.
And, you know, that makes me a Jack Kemp Republican. He said he was a bleeding heart conservative, you know. Too many conservatives gotten the reputation of not caring about poor people. We really should care about poor people and equal opportunity. And that's what this is about. If you just untax that income and put the tax on pollution, you actually improve poor people's lives.
Yeah, and I mean, particularly in this time in the U.S. where I think we see income inequality getting bigger instead of less, you know, how do we rein that piece in as well? So no, I love the idea. I mean, I really am excited to see kind of where this goes with all the work that you're doing there. And Karen, I want to come back to you because I mean, I think you had pointed out, and Bob, you mentioned the same, you know, with Bolsonaro kind of coming in, he's done a lot in terms of the deregulation side, but I think the thing that really struck me as you were talking is there are regulations in place to kind of sign it, but the enforcement is kind of just fallen off. And so that's caused this kind of all of a sudden, it sounds almost like a Wild West out there a little bit where, you know, people are being opportunistic and realizing, hey, I can get away with this. I'm going to come in and kind of do this. And yes, there's a law or there's a regulation, but no one's going to really enforce it. How do you address that? Because to your point, Bob, you know, a lot of people have invested a lot of money knowing how important the Amazon is, not just to Brazil, but to kind of the global system, that if we're being kind of shut out from that, you know, to Karen's point, I mean, we could see ecosystem collapse really follow if we don't kind of get this in check pretty quickly, was kind of my read on that. I don't know, Karen, if you want to start on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, there was a lot there, so I'll try to answer. But I love the question in that as a scholar and that does a lot of work in Latin America, and of course, every nation is different. So I hate to and most of my work is in Costa Rica and then Central America. But there are so many similarities we see in terms of the kind of construction of the state, and then there's of course the cultural behaviors, if you will. But one of the things I often say, actually, with people I work with in Costa Rica is that Americans, when they think about like the state in Costa Rica, will often think like, well, there's a law, so therefore people are doing X, Y, and Z. And they make a lot of assumptions about human behavior based on things like laws and policy. Because and I know this is kind of hard to imagine, but relatively, like, we tend to sort of fall in line a little bit better. Whereas I always joke that with people that sometimes I think the law is a suggestion because, and this actually speaks to some of the challenges brought up about policy, which is that you can have kind of any policy, but they all need enforcement, even our taxes, right? We have a really good structure here to enforce our taxes, whereas in some nations, they don't have a great structure to enforce taxes. So again, to draw on Costa Rican example, there have been a lot of challenges about when they decided not to pass a new law to enforce taxes, just to implement the law that already existed. People were up in arms about it because it had been there, but nobody really been doing anything about it. And so again, it's just a different, I don't think of these, again, I wouldn't say they're lawless states by any stretch of the imagination, but of course, as you move out into more rural areas, which we also see in the United States, but in a place like Brazil, there's a lot less infrastructure in these more rural areas. I was actually in a webinar just yesterday about roads being built in Brazil in these rural areas and the implications for that. And you see these kind of patterns in other places in Latin America, and I do believe it applies to other developing countries, because with a road comes the infrastructure, comes the oversight, but also comes the markets, and you see these kind of compounding effects. So it all goes to say that I think that as someone who's been looking at these different policies for a while now, I think they all need some sort of, and this is where it becomes a challenge from what is the government role, because on some level, a tax code needs a government oversight, payments for environmental services program needs government oversight, or needs somebody to be making sure that this thing actually happens, because we are all used to using the environment for free. Right? Right now, if there's nothing kind of, there's no barrier there, then I'm going to dump in the environment for free, and I'm going to take resources to the extent that I can. And so, you know, it does become really complicated to think about how in different political and cultural contexts these policies do play out.
Yeah, Bob, I don't know if you have anything to add to that in terms of, again, I'm thinking of, you know, what can happen specifically in Brazil. I mean, I love you have kind of a global solution where the US can kind of lead and put in kind of this carbon tax, and then others will follow. But I'm coming back even to like the Brazilian crisis kind of on this.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the key is always, you know, to figure out how to make it in our trading partners' interest, or the people we're trying to affect in their interest to do something, because it's really hard to impose one's will on another group. You know, we have a will for the Brazilians' lives. They don't seem to be following it just yet, and so. You know, there is this thing that I find odd as an American lawyer about the Brazilian legal system, by the way, which is there is no stare decisis, no role of precedent in the Brazilian legal system, and so every case is de novo at their Supreme Court. You don't have precedent to go on. Talk about a Wild West. So you're talking about West. That is a Wild West, because you know, there's people that relied on the property that they were buying and spent a great deal of money. The question is whether you can rely on precedent about that. Unclear you can. Okay, so what do you do with that? You know, how do you can't get them to adopt our American law. You can't say, okay, listen, what you all really need is stare decisis, and you need some American lawyers coming out there and straighten you out. Not going to happen. So, so it comes back to, I think, Dr. Allen's first point, which is those certified products. And what I see that as is using the power of the American marketplace to affect Brazilian decisions. If we stopped buying Brazilian cherry, I remember going to see a friend's house, a campaign donor's house. I said, whoa, look at those floors. What's that? He said, Brazilian cherry. And then later I was able to travel with the congressional committee to Brazil, and I thought about that Brazilian cherry in Charleston, and I thought, oh my, I wish that Brazilian cherry weren't in Charleston. And so if my donor friend had been a little bit more careful about saying, no, thanks, I don't want that. I want American hardwood be fine. Then you'd destroy the market for Brazilian cherry, right? Or you'd reduce it such that it could be sustainably done. I'm into sustainable forestry, but make it sustainable. Chop down just as many Brazilian cherries as you need, and then sell it at that price that somebody is willing to pay, that is the true price of it. So a great deal is wrapped up in that first bullet from Dr. Allen about certified products.
Yeah, no, and I want to follow on that. Maybe this is a question for you, Karen, in terms of, I do think sometimes people think it's all or nothing, right? It's like, is the goal to preserve the Amazon to its pristine, kind of like, let's literally lock it down and not let anyone in there because of all the biodiversity and other stuff in there. Are there ways that we can sustainably manage something like the Amazon that, to Bob's point, kind of allows some development, but does so in a way that preserves the ecosystem, helps the livelihoods of locals? I don't know if you could talk a little bit more. Is it an either or could it be both with some kind of oversight?
Yeah, I like to think both. But the question is, and I think that's why I focus so much on this imperative of a global market and what you're trying to do with that land, right? And if you're, so for example, and I again, referencing this webinar that I sat in on yesterday, it had a lot of indigenous speakers that were livid about this road construction. And it was an area of the Amazon bordering Peru. And it was interesting because, of course, I know that these are a subset of the population. It's not going to be everybody, but it does speak to this, this conversation. You do hear a lot from indigenous Amazonian peoples of not wanting an external development imposed on them, right? There are people in many parts of the Amazon rainforest, often forgotten on a global stage, And to draw a parallel, in Indonesia with some of the deforesting forests, also people are being displaced. And as an anthropologist, there's actually a crisis of the last, well, lots of, I was thinking of hunter-gatherers, but also just indigenous people across the globe are often displaced in this imperative of development. And so the reason I bring that up is because the conflict there is we're looking at kind of the most efficient from a, I like that, the idea of externalities, right? So given the externalities associated with all of these behaviors that are essentially free on these markets, right? So not having a carbon tax, so you can pollute as much carbon dioxide as you want to, and being able to pollute the surrounding environments, those are those externalities. But given all of that, the most efficient land use might be soy, it might be the hydrocarbons that you're digging up, right? And so there's this conflict with some local people that are there who've kind of outlived the biggest surge, if you will, of infringement already, and wanting to be stewards of the land and have a different relationship with that land. But there's the power structure in Brazil saying, hey, this is a great resource. We want money to invest in our country. And again, I don't think that's a wrong desire. That's very much a driving factor on our global stage. So, however, I think there are ways, and I think this is, again, to go back to that idea of the impossible, the probable impossible, I forget the quote, but I'll let you say it in a second. I agree very much with that I mean, COVID has put that out there for us. And I think moving forward, as we're beginning to experience more of these crises, we're gonna have to shift, and we're gonna have to find ways to live more differently with the land, or you know, or have those externalities are going to become insurmountable, the consequences of them.
Yeah. I want to make sure that we get some questions that are showing up in the chat. So I'm going to turn to that for a second here, and I'll read some of them, some of which we've kind of touched on a little bit, but there's one that talks about the fact that Norway has, Brazil has recently requested $1 billion from Western nations to help preserve the forest. And the question says, do you think Norway, the largest donor to Brazil for preserving the rainforest, by freezing that funding is having an impact on Brazil? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing from a strategy standpoint? I don't know if either of you wants to weigh in on that.
Can I let our international politician?
Yeah,
I have my thoughts, but I feel like you probably have more real world grounded experience.
Well, you know, I got to believe that somebody like Bolsonaro is responsive to greenbacks. I was just hearing in The Economist yesterday that he's got some troubles. You know, he's done a particularly poor job with coronavirus. He's got some trouble with the army now, and there's a split in the army between the ones that like him and the ones that don't, and so he's in a precarious spot, and he may be looking at Lula coming back in 2022 now that he's been cleared of wrongdoing or whatever. He's potentially now to come back. So money talks, and you know, so you can use that aid effectively, and that makes some sense, doesn't it? Norway is a major producer of petroleum products, and so to use some of that wealth to basically offset it in the Amazon makes some sense, and then make sure to get some bang for it. In other words, get them to take care of the Amazons with that money. So it makes sense to me. It's one of the things you can do to affect their behavior.
And I guess a follow-up on that was asking then, suppose that, you know, there's been this push to bring this $1 billion to help preserve the rainforest. Where does that money actually go? I mean, like, you know, the question basically says, do we have any idea what Brazil will do with the $1 billion that actually makes it to the rainforest? Is it going to be replacement pay for people not to mine there? Are you going to almost pay them not to cut things down or mine? And if we gave Brazil the money, would anything real change in the right direction, I guess was the follow-up. So that's an interesting question in terms of, I understand the the demand to save the forest. They're trying to actually say, pay us to protect it. But where would that money actually go?
Yeah, I can start with that one as someone who's looked a lot at where that money goes in other places. So the first piece is ultimately there's a risk there, right? Because we don't fully know, but hopefully through international pressure and oversight, we could make the money could be quite conditional. So how does that money enter these developing nations, perhaps more broadly? There's a couple different ways. So the supporting the state regulation programs that help, for example, have moratoriums on products that are deforesting the Amazon. So I know in the past there's been like soy moratoriums and beef moratoriums that have, you know, to try to stop essentially these products that are coming directly out of deforested Amazon. So that would be an infrastructure kind of oversight piece, helping those environmental, often these you know, we can think about like the EPA here, but when I go to the equivalent EPA office in other countries, you know, they can be quite underfunded, right? So you could have a moment like that, or you could have an institution like that. Other programs that are quite popular, there's of course public-private protected area. I'm sorry, public-private. There are public protected areas all across, just like our national park system, if you will, and national forests. There are public protected areas that it could go to help fund, because of course those cost a lot of money to be able to continue to guard and monitor and make sure people aren't illegally harvesting and deforesting those areas. And then another quite popular one is this idea of direct payments to landowners. So if I am somebody who, you know, it has a plot of land with a environmental potential, right? Could I receive essentially money? And this is a lot of offsets try to focus on this kind of program as well. So I get money from somewhere, and a lot of these international programs are funding these. RED is a popular one for those who might have heard of that. And so could I get money from these donating organizations to then pay farmers and essentially incentivize them to not deforest? And so those are the major ones that come to mind that I have seen implemented. I'm not sure if there's others that people wanted to bring up.
Well, and I'll follow on that because you mentioned carbon offsets, because I think that's an interesting one. So like I've been doing increasingly more work with the Shy Institute with corporations. You know, there are these global corporations that are striving to be carbon neutral, and they're doing a good job kind of reducing their footprint and everything else. But in the end, they're going to have to go out and fund a carbon offset somewhere. Is that I mean, I think it's probably a question of like, how do you regulate and oversee and make sure it's enforceable? It's not just greenwashing or something that's going on. But it seems like there could be a market all of a sudden for carbon offsetting in the Amazon that you could get a lot of corporate companies around the globe to maybe get behind. Bob, I don't know if you have an idea that kind of speaks to your, you know, there's like an incentive to kind of do it. And to your point, Karen, like RED and some of these other things have kind of experimented with that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's viable or not, but it seems like that carbon market's going to grow in terms of people wanting to go out and get offsets to offset footprints.
Yeah, and of course, it is really important to make sure to track the accounting on that, right? And I think that Jeff Bezos has just given, is it EDF or maybe NRDC, a great deal of money, as in $100 million, I think it was, to develop a good tracking system and to track the whether it's true accounting. In other words, was the tree actually planted? Is it actually offset? Because otherwise you're just kidding yourself, right? And so, but I hope that's also expanded, Wes, to include perhaps direct air capture, because that could help the economics of that new technology that we're advantaging right now. Speaking of tax expenditures, as I was earlier, there's a 45Q provision of the tax code that has an advantage for direct air capture. It's crucial, and it needs to be expanded. And if the companies you're talking about could improve those economics by buying into that direct air capture machine, if you will. In other words, there'll be machines that do this stuff, and they're not economic at this moment without that tax expenditure support. But also, if companies started buying shares of said equipment, that could be really exciting because that's really verifiable, right? I mean, you can measure that because you are literally sucking CO2 out of the air.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I saw some, you're mentioning the greenwashing concern. Again, I think people are starting to realize, with the rush to carbon offsetting, it's only really effective if you're protecting an area that isn't already protected. So like people are kind of going in and saying, oh, I'm going to protect this, peat bog that's there. Well, it was never going to be developed anyway, right? It's always going to be there. So it is just kind of almost a greenwashing where you're investing in something that's already saved. So how do you make sure that it's true accounting? What your money is actually helping protect an area and really, whether it's a land lease or something that's going to protect it, otherwise it would have been developed, is I think fascinating to kind of think about on a grand scale.
Yeah.
Right, and a huge challenge there is to help them. I mean, so a lot of these payments are not at market value, right? So the reason it's not protecting things that are actually at risk is because it's not competing with any of the alternative land uses, right? And I'll get into that a bit. And while a better competitive price certainly would help influence landowner behavior, there is an added value or added challenge of, you're asking people to change their way of life. And there might be a premium on that, and there might be a lot of other obstacles, which is why, going back to your last question, Wes, the idea of integrated landscapes, I think, is actually quite promising, particularly in some of these more rural areas like certain parts of Brazil, where, if I can have some land uses, but also buffers and smaller scale and integrated landscapes, then I'm able to keep my way of life. But I'm also not, I'm not contributing to this problem so extensively. So again, back to that idea of silver buckshot to John Foley.
Well, and John Foley, I know well. I mean, he talked about terraforming, I think, of that same idea, this idea of, we tend to put a bad stigma on farming, but actually there's a lot of ways to enhance ecosystem services if you do it right. And he has some great work and great papers kind of looking at, I love that idea of kind of, it's like farming for the greater good of the earth, as opposed to thinking of farming as deforestation and destruction.
Right.
Well, I want to encourage, I know we have some listeners kind of on there. I think that's the bulk of the questions that were kind of asked in the chat, but there's still time. If any folks that are on the call want to ask any last remaining question or two of Bob or Karen, I'm willing to kind of pass it along. Otherwise, I think maybe I'll give you, Bob or Karen, just a chance to share any kind of closing thoughts, and then I can close this out here shortly. Unless there's anything else you think you want to make sure you want to share or get into the group, because this is one of those topics we could talk for hours. But I know there's Zoom fatigue.
And I do.
Yeah, and I know audiences suffer from Zoom fatigue, so I want to be conscious of the fact that we've been at it for an hour and 10 or hour and 15 almost here. So I don't want to overwhelm them at all, but I want to make sure we get a chance to cover any last thoughts that either of you had. I don't know, Bob, you want to leave us with any closing thoughts about this big problem?
Well, I think that, the reality is that we've got a political problem in America on this. Actually, it's maybe deeper than politics. It's an identity problem, because sadly, my party has gotten to a place of deciding that it's not our identity. It's not our thing. We don't do climate. It's actually improved a great deal since I got tossed out of Congress, in 2010. Back then, it really was a heresy. Now, the decade of disastrous disputation, as we call it at republicen.org, is over. It ended in 2018 when my party lost control of the U.S. House by losing suburban districts with a retro position on climate change. And so that has fully dawned on Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader in the House, who would like to be Speaker someday. And his time frame is different than Donald Trump's. You know, Donald Trump was trying to eke out one last victory in 2020. Kevin McCarthy is looking at 22, 24, 26, 28, and he's seen the demographic change coming. Your students, Wes and Karen, who are actual conservatives who care about climate change, they want their party to be realistic and relevant to their futures. So Kevin McCarthy sees that coming. The question is whether we're going to make that move quickly enough to head off the worst of the consequences of climate change, because every year that we delay, it gets more expensive to fix. You know, it's just so important to get going. And so we've got a political challenge. It's really an identity challenge, and it's going to be overcome. The question is whether it's overcome quickly enough. And I just hope that from the left, I'm talking about all the needs on the right, on the left, there's a need for grace for people like me, you know, 6 years in Congress saying climate change was nonsense. Out 6 years, came back for another 6 with a different point of view. And I've been extended a fair amount of grace by people who have allowed me into the conversation. We really need people to do that with their friends and relatives who are on the right. If they're on the left, they need to let those people on the right into the conversation and welcome them, not tell them, oh yeah, you're the dumb kid in the class, last one to get it, huh? You finally got it, you dumb. That's not a winning approach. And so we're literally in this one together, and we've got to find a way quickly to move through it and to solve it.
Yeah, you are spot on. I was going to say, you know, and that is one of the things that, I think the left has to watch themselves to realize that we're all in this together, and the polarization or the polarized situation we're in now is not going to, you know, cramming something down someone else's throat is not going to get us all to the finish line. How do we pull everybody into the conversation in a way that works for kind of everybody is going to be a real challenge. Yeah. Karen, you want any last thoughts on your end before we close out?
I don't think I can top that. I just, the one point that I just want to kind of reiterate is that urgency piece. And I think the urgency piece I find the hardest, to be honest, because I see, you know, from my humble perspective, despite all of the other stuff, I actually do see this turning point that Bob's talking about, and I worry that it's not going to be fast enough, that I worry that we're not going to get there in time. And I sometimes talk to my classes about growing up in the 80s and hearing about climate change and how it was, you know, for some reason it wasn't presented to me so contentiously. I don't know if it was where I was living or if things were actually different in the 80s versus the 90s, but I remember hearing about it, and it kind of just, it was presented as like, don't worry, we're going to get our acts together by 2020 when it's going to be a real problem. And then 2020 rolls around, right? And I'm thinking, how did this, you know, how did we get here? And of course, I think we know how we got here, but it is quite urgent. And I know that's a hard message to tell people when we want to, you know, our time scale versus the Earth's time scale versus this moment of crisis, right? So I appreciate you bringing that up, that we need to get our acts together, and we got to do it now. And I think we all have a role to play in it. It's not just they need to get their acts together, we all collectively.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, again, I'm with you. I think that my biggest concern is urgency. I think people are understanding. I don't feel that when I talk to folks, it's not that they don't believe climate change is happening anymore. I think sometimes now the next discussion is just how urgent that problem is. This is not a kick the can down to 2050 where we set these lofty, you know, neutrality goals where we say by 2100 we'll be carbon neutral. It'll be too late if we wait till 2100. To have
when these other needs are so pressing. So of course, how do you tell someone to care about climate change? Even it's gonna affect you, right? But it doesn't seem like it's right there yet, even when I'm having to move for the storm and what have you, right?
Well, and I think that's where the sustainability science lens is so important. You know, it's this interconnectivity, right? The pandemic, climate change, racial discord, these are interconnected things. These are not isolated. You're not going to tackle them in isolation. We have to think of them as they really are actually very, very closely and explicitly linked. Well, thank you both for your time. This has been phenomenal. Bob, it's been great to catch up. I know I've had you to campus numerous times. It's wonderful to see you, and want to thank you for all the great work you're doing with your organization. Karen, you and I colleagues, obviously, although with COVID, we don't see each other as often as in person as we should. I think we spend more time on Zoom than we do actually in person. So I'm looking forward to the pandemic. Looking forward to the pandemic coming to a close here so we can reunite. I also want to thank the World Affairs Council Update for hosting this series, and wanted to leave with a few comments they've asked me to kind of share with you. So the World Affairs Council Upstate wants to thank everyone for participating in today's event. This is actually the final event of their 2020-21 online America in the World Conversation Series. So stay tuned, be on the lookout about next year's America in the World Series. And there's hope, and we are confident that it will return to in-person lunch and learn format as it has pre-pandemic. Upstate International, just for those that don't know them as well, offers lots of different events beyond just the speaker series. They have cultural events and language classes that will be offered all summer long. And so for more information about Upstate International or to register for any of their events, I want to encourage you to check out their website, upstateinternational.org. And with that, I think I'll close us off and thank all our participants and listeners for joining us. And Kim, I don't know if you have any last thing to close us out, but I will turn it back over to you.